Mastering modal verbs. Dodge common mistakes with should, ought to, and had better. Hello, dear learners. Welcome back to our comprehensive English language learning series. Today, we'll be diving deeper into the world of modal verbs, focusing on should, ought to, and had better. These are powerful tools we often use to give or ask for advice, but they can be a bit tricky sometimes. Don't worry, by the end of this video, you'll have a better grasp of these modal verbs and know how to avoid common mistakes associated with them. So, let's get started. First off, let's address some of the most common mistakes that learners often make when using should, ought to, and had better. One key mistake is using to after should. Remember, should is always followed by the base form of a verb. So, instead of saying, you should to go, we say, you should go. Next, many students confuse ought to with ought not. Ought to implies a strong recommendation, while ought not suggests something should not be done. Therefore, it's wrong to say, you ought to not do it. Instead, we say, you ought not do it, or you ought not to do it. Lastly, had better can cause confusion. We often shorten had to d, but be careful. If you say, you'd better go, some people might confuse this with you would better go, which is incorrect. So, to avoid ambiguity, it's safer to say, you had better go. Now, let's move on to some practical tips to help you avoid these common mistakes. 1. For should, always remember it is followed by the base form of a verb. Practice by making sentences using should. For example, you should drink more water. 2. When it comes to ought to, think of it as a strong recommendation. It's also worth noting that ought to and should can often be used interchangeably. Practice using it in positive and negative sentences, such as, you ought to study for your exam, or you ought not neglect your health. 3. For had better, remember that this phrase indicates a strong recommendation or a warning, and it carries more urgency than should or ought to. Be careful not to confuse your listener by shortening had to d. Practice with sentences like, we had better leave early to avoid traffic. Finally, remember that practice is key. Create your own sentences using should, ought to, and had better. Try them in different contexts, both positive and negative. Write them down, say them out loud, use them in conversation. The more you use these modals, the more comfortable you'll become with them. And that's a wrap for this session, dear learners. We hope that this deep dive into should, ought to, and had better has shed some light on how to use these modal verbs correctly and avoid common mistakes. Remember, practice makes perfect. So, keep practicing and keep learning. See you in our next video. Happy learning!